up at the escape room thing, or like, should we stay here?
Honestly, I don't know.
I think that the escape room is like around 9, so I assume we go back.
We go back.
to hotels, yeah, next week.
Yeah, we're just making sure we can get a ride.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Is everyone ready?
Grab a cold drink.
Everyone good? Okay. Brentwood negates. Contention 1 is the last resort. Subpoint A is the U.S. Military intervention in Venezuela is off the table now. As AFP 19 explains, that Secretary of State Mike Pompeo has publicly corroborated that military intervention is not planned in the status quo. Unfortunately, voting affirmative leaves the U.S. with no choice but to use hard power. As Levi 19 writes, that U.S. sanctions are our only alternative to military intervention. Hertz of FES 19 notes that the U.S. is avoiding intervention with Venezuela and prefers to take the path of political pressure and economic sanctions on Maduro and his international allies. Thus, the removal of sanctions would leave Trump with no choice but to send in the military. Indeed, oil would be a major incentive. Blackwall 19 writes that if America surrenders its influence in Venezuela, the world's largest supply of oil could fall into the hands of Russia and China. As such, says Nazi 19 finds to the U.S. Venezuelan oil reserves are worthy of a large-scale military intervention. The impact of intervention would be catastrophic. Moore 19 writes that the U.S. would most likely pursue precision strikes on Venezuela to topple the regime, following up with cyber attacks on critical infrastructure and defenses. Ultimately, Moore concludes that it would push around 8 million Venezuelan refugees and result in complete anarchy. Subpoint B is Colombia. Tensions are high between Colombia and Venezuela, as the DW19 writes that both countries are flexing their military on their border. Even more, Venezuela is increasingly aggravated because of the invocation of the Cold War-era pact called the TIAR Treaty, that Maduro claims could open doors to an invasion. DW concludes that this is fueling fears of potential conflict. However, sanctions are crucial to preventing a conflict, as NPR 19 writes that the U.S. and Colombia are close allies in the region, thus mirroring each other's policy towards Venezuela. This is especially key as NPR continues that for Colombia, Plan A is to keep sanctions and pressure, but if that fails, Plan B is conventional entanglement. When Colombia sees its major ally pull out of their sanctions process, it will realize that all other solutions have been thrown out of the window. Colombia has an incentive, as Weiss 19 writes that Colombia believes Venezuela is an existential threat to their survival, blaming Venezuela for harboring Colombian terrorist groups. Daniels of The Guardian 19 writes that invigorated by the right-wing government of Brazil, Colombia could start an offensive on Venezuela, an offensive that would be fought over infrastructure in citizen-filled cities. The impact of an armed conflict would be devastating. Overall, the BBC 14 concludes that empirically in Latin America, armed conflicts with Colombian terrorist groups have killed 220,000 and displaced 5 million. Contention 2 is a better future. Maduro's strict economic regulation destroyed Venezuela. Ben Zaquin of New York Times 17 writes that heavy government regulation stifled domestic production and weakened local producers. This in turn ruined profitability and created shortages. For this reason, Ortego 19 finds that unrealistic price controls were the immediate cause of the Venezuelan economic collapse. Fortunately, sanctions have loosened Maduro's hold on the Venezuelan economy. Vice of Wall Street Journal 19 writes that the easing of state controls is a response to U.S. sanctions that have damaged Maduro's ability to pay into the public sector. Argus 19 concludes that sanctions have forced Maduro to erase price and currency controls to encourage foreign investment. These reforms are working, as the Washington Post finds that just last month, sanctions haven't hurt overall imports since private Venezuelans are unaffected. Even more, Argus continues that the private sector will account for 25% of the GDP in the first time in decades. Venezuela's annual inflation rate has already fallen nearly 3 million percent last year, as Smith of NPR last week finds that some economists estimate hyperinflation will largely subside in the end of this year due to the removal of currency restrictions. The sanctions are key as Corrales, the New York Times 18 writes that absent pressure, Maduro will aim to extinguish the private sector as it forces his people to become fiscally dependent solely on him. The impact is energizing the economy. Alvarez 20 finds that continued liberalization will lead to stabilization of the Venezuelan economy. Lopez 19 terminalizes with these market reforms, the economy is projected to grow by 4% in 2020. Patton 19 empirically confirms that in places like Brazil and Argentina, when market liberalization is embraced, inflation drops and poverty is dramatically reduced. For these reasons, communicate.
Can we see that Maduro will stop the private sector if sanctions are lifted?
Yeah.
Wait, this is the card that says if sanctions are lifted, then Maduro will reverse the reforms?
It's the warranty. It's the warranty.
Alright, that's...
Is everyone ready? We affirm, intention 1 is debt. Venezuela's dug themselves a hole in their foreign debt. Constable 19 confirms their external debt is now twice their GDP, with a debt to GDP ratio of 221% and investment and growth faltering while inflation rises. U.S. sanctions are exacerbating the crisis in two ways. The first is by removing America from the equation. American investors want Venezuelan bonds. The VOA 18 writes it for years. Venezuelan PDVSA bonds have provided incredible yields, making them a mainstay of emerging market bond funds. Unfortunately, Carbon 18 gives two reasons why America's August 2017 sanctions and cutting U.S. debt managers off. A, under U.S. sanctions plans, it is impossible for U.S. creditors to negotiate a debt restructuring plan. And B, U.S. bondholders are unable to participate in any bond exchange, which Sachs 19 finds is devastating because in order to reduce the debt, Venezuela has to exchange old bonds for new ones. Overall, Sachs confirms pre-August 2017 sanctions, Venezuela is set to renegotiate, and Line 19 concludes Maduro still plans to renegotiate if given the ability. The second is through cutting off financial institutions. Proposal 19 finds if Venezuela had the ability, they turn to the IMF in pursuit of a structured adjustment program or SAP. Halton 18 finds SAPs are programs imposed by the IMF which restructure a nation's debt, stimulate the economy, and stabilize government spending. Unfortunately, Wiseman 17 explains the U.S. uses their leverage within the IMF to block these debt restructuring deals. If left unchecked, the high debt will prompt Venezuela to default. Wiseman outlines the creditors engaged to demand their loans back, which will consequently result in a seizure of their oil assets, prompting them to collateralize oil. Thomas 19 concludes this will cause state collapse as Venezuela loses the entire backbone of their economy. The impact of restructuring Venezuela's debt is unparalleled growth. Thomas quantifies it to double GDP, and the economists conclude each 1% increase in GDP reduces poverty by 1.7%. Historically, Wiseman 17 impacts the last time Venezuela was in a period of economic prosperity, poverty was reduced by 70%. Intention 2 is oil. Fernandez 19 finds Venezuela is considered a petrostate, with oil composing 99% of their export revenue. However, U.S. sanctions incapacitated the industry in two ways. The first is by choking off American markets. Leatherman 19 finds Venezuela's oil industry is dependent on the U.S. as we account for 75% of their exports. But Krauss 19 finds U.S. sanctions cut off sales not only to the U.S. but to the rest of the world and will cut Venezuela's exports by 2/3, shrinking their economy by 26% over the coming year. Second is cutting off financing. Sachs 19 finds in 2017, following U.S. fears of government crackdown in Venezuela, it imposed sanctions that prohibited any borrowing from U.S. financial markets, which meant that Venezuela had lost any mechanism of increasing credit and financing. For these two reasons, Fernandez 19 estimates current oil exports are bringing in just 4.7% of what they did in the decade prior to sanctions. Emersberger 19 continues in a quote, worst case prediction, production has fallen by 37% since sanctions were first imposed, and the total revenue difference from a world in which sanctions were never imposed versus the status quo is $6 billion. Thus, Bloomberg yesterday found that total revenue within Venezuela has hit its lowest point since 1989. Overall, it is no surprise that Brestar 19 finds the economy is only operating at 19% of its capacity under sanctions. Reviving Venezuela's oil sector pursues economic growth in two areas. The first is Venezuela. Despierto 19 quantifies oil comprises 25% of Venezuela's gross domestic product, with Ferro 19 concluding struggles in the sector are expected to decline Venezuela's economy by 30%. The economist impacts each 1% increase in GDP per head reduces poverty by 1.7%, particularly 90% of the population at the bottom. The second is the rest of the world. Verliger 18 finds Venezuela's oil industry's collapse will exhaust global surplus production, with a gap being left that no country has the capacity to compensate. Thus, Arends 19 finds oil prices will spike from $70 to $130. This oil price spike has two implications. The first comes from Iran's finds because oil is like oxygen to the economy. Subsequently, prices rising to just $110 a barrel would be enough to trigger a global recession. The IMF concludes this would push 900 million people into poverty. The second is food prices. Aglav 19 finds that a $1 increase in oil prices increases food prices by $3.34%. The World Bank 11 impacts the 10% increase in food prices pushes 10 million people into poverty. Thus, we affirm.
We see the Fernandez card. No, sorry. Oh, the one that Maduro like recently said he still wants to restructure.
Oh, yeah, the line.
I think it is the Fernandez card too, though.
Fernandez is.
4.7%.
Oh, okay. Those are two separate cards. You just want their exports are going down.
It was like whatever the Fernandez card was, but also the first one.
Okay, so this is the revenues like drastically decrease, and then I can show you that Maduro wants to renegotiate.
Yeah. All right, we'll start with that.
And then Maduro wants to
Yeah.
renegotiate.
We'll start right now. Cool. Thank you. That was like 19 seconds.
Your answer first.
I'm good. Can I get first question?
Yeah.
Okay, so let's talk about your second impact. Okay, so basically your second impact is that if Venezuela stops selling oil to a bunch of people, that leaves like a gap in like the global oil demand, right?
No, our argument is that if Venezuela runs out of revenue, they can't reinvest in oil, can't invest in the oil sector at all, which causes it to collapse. And because Venezuela contributes so much to the global supply, our argument is that prices would increase so drastically that nobody can compensate for it,
Right,
and that
so,
causes
like,
a recession.
So like it's that Venezuela doesn't like contribute to the global supply of oil, right?
Yeah, they contribute like zero.
But isn't your entire like link chain that like Venezuela's already being cut off from the global supply of oil?
Yeah,
Like,
our
they
argument,
can't sell
our argument
oil?
is that they're decreasing their sales, but they still have the ability to produce. And I'm sure that has an effect on countries like Saudi Arabia for producing less because they know Venezuela still has the reserves. But if they lose all money and can't produce, then there's no way that anyone's getting oil. Can I have a question?
Go for it.
Okay, so on your first contention, on your sub-point A about U.S. intervention, right? So your internal warrant is that the U.S. wants to get is afraid that Russia and China are going to gain control of Venezuelan oil.
Right, but mainly the Levon card, which shows you that sanctions are the only alternative to the like a U.S. military intervention.
Okay, my question is, if the oil warrant is true and the U.S. is concerned about China and Russia getting their oil, why wouldn't they intervene in the status quo?
Because right now, like the U.S. clamping down is like deterring Russia and China from like going
That's
in.
not
Like
true.
that's
Russia and China
like that's
increase their influence in the region.
that's also not true. Like Russia and China has been like they've stopped loaning Venezuela and they've stopped like conducting operations. They've also decreased investment. Like we can give you a bunch of cards like if you want rebuttal. Can I get a question?
Yeah.
So like let's talk about like your first implication on your second impact.
Right.
On your second contention. It's like a global recession, right? Like Venezuela is already like you said, like locked out of the financial system. Let's say like Venezuela is locked out of the financial system and they can't like export oil, right? Shouldn't we seen this impact materialize already?
Right, same answer as I said earlier. Our argument is that sure, even if theoretically it should happen, our argument is that they still sell into some countries, and more importantly, other countries don't have the incentive to produce.
Like, what's
because
the bright line? Like how much oil does Venezuela need to stop like selling for a recession to like kick in?
Our argument is that their sector has to collapse so that they can't put any more money back into it, but the Bloomberg evidence says that's really near because their revenue's the lowest it's been in like almost 30 years. Can I have a question?
Go for it.
Okay. So, on the Colombia argument, right? So, what was happening in terms of Maduro and Colombia pre-sanctions?
I'm not sure. I'm sure he's
So Maduro was negotiating with Colombia pre-sanctions. Because
Right.
Maduro sees Colombia and America, or Colombia's like a proxy state of America, he stopped negotiating with them following American sanctions. So if you lift sanctions, will Maduro go back to the negotiating table?
Probably not.
Why?
Because literally, like, our DW card shows you that they've been, like, flexing their military
Yeah,
on
they're
the
flexing
border,
their
like,
military
right
because
now.
American sanctions are there, so they're flexing their military on an American proxy
The
state.
only reason why Colombia hasn't invaded is because of U.S. sanctions.
My question is
right?
about Venezuela though.
Right, if Colombia invades, I'm sure Venezuela's going to invade too.
Why
Like,
did
they can
Colombia
invade anyway.
invade pre-sanctions?
Why didn't Colombia invade pre-sanctions? We're telling you the incentive to, like, invade is, like, fairly new. But, like,
We'll run some prep starting now. Alright, we have like a minute 30. Everybody good? I'm just gonna get down here, please. But I'll actually start off with Wang at the top. Okay. Start off with some Wang. We would argue that in the status quo, we are saying that Venezuela is on the path to recovery, and that is because sanctions are pressuring Maduro to liberalize. That's why Lopez, from our impact on the second contention, quantifies that Venezuela is projected to grow by 4% in 2020. We would say that right now, Venezuela is on the track to recovery, and that the only way is negation, but by affirming and taking off sanctions, you risk all of these bad economic impacts that we would say like carries over to the rest of the world and like risk this recession and things like that too. Well, let's start on their first contention specifically about debt. A couple of overarching responses. There are a few reasons why debt refinancing is not going to happen regardless. The first is multilateral institutions. As Cartman of the International Economy 18 writes that any debt restructuring would be nearly impossible without the assistance of large financial institutions. But it's problematic because Maduro has specifically alienated institutions like the IMF and the World Bank because Maduro is censoring their data. Maduro will never go to them, and neither will the IMF. But second, it's nobody's going to buy bonds. They say the bonds are going to be valued, but literally like Venezuela is basically in a crisis. No one's going to buy them. That's why America's Quarterly 19 explains that in the years before sanctions, Venezuela hiked up the yields on their bonds because literally no one was willing to buy them, concluding that capital markets had decided it was too risky to lend money to Venezuela and that negotiations that they talk about were going nowhere. But third, Maduro doesn't even want to restructure. Even if he says in theory he does, we would just say he's just doing that to get sympathy. Because America's Quarterly 19 explains when the oil prices dropped in 2014, Maduro knew he needed to do debt restructuring, but instead he opted to cut food and medicine imports. Even if you give him the opportunity, he's not actually going to do it. But secondly, the world financial system was already shutting out Maduro before sanctions. Rodriguez 19 writes that Venezuela's political crisis had already deterred investors and toxified the economy, shutting out Venezuela from the rest of the world. But third, Venezuela analysis last week finds that Venezuela is renegotiating its foreign debt in exchange for offering creditors in joint venture oil projects. This functions as a turn too, because we would argue the only way Venezuela is able to restructure its debt is through privatizing oil. Actually a Lincoln, not a turn, I guess. But the only way he's able to restructure his debt is by privatizing oil, which we'd argue he only has the incentive to in our world. But then, specifically on their like second link about like institutions, like the U.S. shutting out institutions, we'd argue that happens with or without sanctions. The U.S. is always going to like pressure the IMF to go away from Venezuela. That happens with or without sanctions. It's not the specific sanctions link. Well, let's go second contention about oil. A couple of responses why oil is bouncing back. VIU of Cohen 20 writes that joint venture projects is Maduro ceding oil control to joint venture projects, which Argus in December concludes that the joint venture cooperation would restore oil output to 2 million barrels per day in 2020, which is almost pre-sanction levels. And second is rising markets. Reuters finds that just last month, oil exports rose by 20% because new buyers like India and Spain allowed Maduro to sell more oil. Even if sanctions caused an oil decline in the past, right now oil is recovering. But if anything, you can turn it because oil going down spurs diversification. As Johnson of Foreign Policy 19 writes that Venezuela was eager to diversify beyond just oil, but the government could make enough easy money off oil that they neglected other parts of their economies. We would say this is best in the long term because when Venezuela diversifies and stops being so reliant on the oil industry, this helps them in every single recession in the long term that they try to impact to. But they talk about this $6 billion in revenue loss. But there's two reasons why, it doesn't really matter in the context of the round, because Yates of the National Defense University 19 writes that the $6 billion they talk about would have just been distributed among political elites who support Maduro and not the actual Venezuelan economy. But if anything, Yates continues that's just a drop in the bucket because Maduro's mismanagement has caused over $633 billion in losses. We would say Venezuela's oil is going to be just fine, but the only way for long-term hope in the Venezuelan economy is by voting for us, which we would argue impacts to like every single like other country in the world and all of this recession stuff. For these reasons, we negate.
Actually, can we see that it'll spur diversification because they neglected other parts of their economy?
Yeah.
Oh, and that joint venture projects will restore production to 2 million barrels?
Yeah.
This is 2 million barrels.
It's the highlighting part. So
Okay, cool. Thank you. Okay, and then we're still waiting on the
Yeah. I read the wrong card, but here it is.
so that's not Wait, this is your evidence for that it'll spur diversification?
It's the one too. Wait, I showed you the wrong card. You can actually run that prep that on like ours. This is the card we actually use. I'm sorry about that.
It's not easy.
Okay, there you go. I'm sorry.
Okay.
Okay. So everyone, it's going to start with front lines, top down, starting with his weighing, and then down there it goes.
start with the Lopez evidence. They say the GDP is going to grow by 4%. There's absolutely no warrant. It literally says that it's one random Venezuelan economist that predicts this. Instead, for the United Nations at the bottom of 2019, which predicted that we were set to see further contraction in the economy in Venezuela throughout 2020, our warrants are very clear. We're seeing oil production going down. We're seeing revenue going down. All indicators show that the economy is decreasing. Don't let one economist sway. Then, on our first contention, we're going to concede all of the defense. Maduro will be unable to access financial markets, and as a result, won't be able to restructure debt. That also non-uniques their turn about privatization, because that means even in the affirmative world, Maduro won't be able to restructure debt, and as a result, privatization will continue in the affirmative world. That also is going to non-unique the response they read, the first response they read on our second contention, where they say that joint venture projects mean that oil production is going to increase to 2 million barrels because he has the incentive to privatize in either world. But what is unique here is the profitability of the oil experts. They say that oil production increased by 20%. First of all, that only analyzes the last couple of months of 2019, but for our evidence, which comes from Reuters in 2019, that explains that overall throughout 2019, there was a 33% reduction in production from January to December. Don't just look at the last quarter, look to the overall. But the real critical argument here is that Watson in 2019 explains that even if oil production increases, it's not profitable under sanctions because they don't have access to things like refineries in America, as well as transport costs are way too high because of sanctions. As a result, even though oil production is increasing, we're still seeing revenue decreasing right now, which is why the cross evidence goes unresponded says that sanctions have shrunk their economy by 26%. Also, then they say that its turn is going to be more diversification. Their card says that Maduro has been diversifying. Our argument is Maduro has an alternative incentive to diversify, but the only way that he's actually able to diversify is in a world when you affirm and actually make the oil sector profitable. At that point, they drop all of the impacts. Our evidence indicates, the Bristol evidence says that the economy is literally operating at 19% of its capacity as a result of these sanctions. You're going to see massive growth when you affirm. Then the complete impacts get dropped. We say that there's currently a 30% shrink in the economy, and as a result, the economist says every 1% increase in GDP reduces poverty by 1.7%. You get that back when you go for the affirmative. Then he drops the global recession. There's no responses here. Don't let them read new analysis and summary. Our evidence indicates that as a result of the lack of profitability of oil production, the Venezuelan economy is driving up global oil prices. For example, we are already seeing 2% increase in oil prices globally as a result of the Venezuelan economy. But our argument is even larger than that. The Aaron's evidence says that when it reaches $110 as a result of the current trend of the status quo, we're going to see a global recession thrusting 900 million people into poverty. That outweighs all of their impacts. One, because we say it's a much better link into conflict and stuff like that, because people are far more likely to go into conflict when there's things like a global recession and stuff like that. Specifically places like Latin America, and also on their second contention, obviously the economy is going to be hurt. Let's go to their case. At the top of their first contention, we would say that America has no incentive to go to war, specifically because 2 weeks ago, The Economist reports that Maduro has agreed to negotiate with the Trump administration, and as a result, the United States has no incentive to go to war with someone that is currently negotiating with us. But even further, we would say that Trump's ulterior incentive is to win the 2020 election, with Carter in 2019 finding that 86% of Americans are against foreign intervention. There's literally no incentive for Trump to go to war. It won't happen. Then, on their second subpoint about Colombia, first, Foreign Policy 2019 finds that Maduro is already militarizing the border, which is why the Atlantic Council, which from a couple weeks ago, finds there's high chance of miscalculation on the border. That happens in the status quo. The only way to solve back for that is to benefit the Venezuelan economy and allow Maduro to not focus on things like militarization and like the illegal drug trade and stuff like that, and focus instead on the legal economy, which is the sole reason why the chance of miscalculation is high right now. But we would also say that there's literally no chance that they intentionally sparked the conflict. They free this rhetoric argument that it's an existential conflict. We would say that there's literally no existential crisis in a world where the Venezuelan economy does better and they can no longer need to militarize the border. Then, go to their second contention. We would say that all of the reforms that they talk about are going to persist in the affirmative vote. In fact, their own article says that the Maduro regime is benefiting from these reforms because the economy is doing better, which is the exact reason why he won't backtrack these reforms. Then, even further, when they talk about dollarization and stuff like that, we say that dollarization gets benefited when you vote for the affirmative. One, because we have a huge inflow of US dollars, but two, the Associated Press in 2019 finds that as a result of lifting sanctions, the United States would be able to peg the bolivar to the US dollar and increase and reduce hyperinflation, allowing the dollar to proliferate in Venezuela. Okay. You ready for cross?
Yeah, sure.
You can have the first question when you're ready.
So, on this recession impact, right? So it hasn't happened yet, and if oil production is going up in the status quo, where's the recession?
So here's the key. Oil production is increasing in Venezuela, but one, they're unable to reach global markets, and as a result, it's too expensive.
We say oil exports are going up by 20%, sorry.
I know your article, it talks about oil production, it doesn't say exports, but that doesn't even matter. Our argument is that as a result of the increased transport costs, as a result of the inability to access American refineries, Venezuela has to sell oil at a higher price and get less profit, and that drives up global oil prices, which is why our evidence indicates global oil prices are already increasing by 2% as a result of the Venezuelan fall.
Right. Can I ask a question now? Yeah. Okay. Let's talk about this idea of Colombia going to war. What's the incentive of Colombia to go to war if the Venezuelan economy gets better and Maduro no longer needs to militarize the border?
Because they think Maduro is like an absolutely horrible person for the whole region as a whole. So they're relying on sanctions right now to push him out. But without sanctions, they literally have no other
But why do
option.
they dislike Maduro?
The same reason I dislike Maduro, the same reason you dislike Maduro.
Right.
Like, he's obviously a horrible leader. He's like the border of the country.
But what's the threat that Maduro poses other than the militarization of the border?
I mean, like, obviously, like, the refugee crisis is spilling over into Colombia. Like,
Sure,
there's a
so
ton of reasons
if the
why
economy
Venezuela's
increases,
doing
then
that.
there will be less refugees, right? Like, what I'm trying to get at is if we solve for the economy, don't we solve for Colombia's incentive to go to war with Venezuela?
No. I mean, we would just say
Why
that
not?
even if Maduro, like, even if the economy gets better, Maduro is, like, still a problem for the region.
Why?
Why?
If he
Because he's a horrible
demilitarizes,
leader.
I mean,
Like,
okay,
he
you keep
as,
saying that,
as
but
a
if he,
whole is
if,
just a risk to the region.
right, but Colombia would be like guaranteeing the fact that their own citizens die if they go to war with Venezuela. So we have to look at it from Colombia's perspective, right?
Sure.
If there's no imminent threat of Venezuela, which, for example, is like the militarization of the border, then what's Colombia's incentive to go to war?
The same thing I just said last time. But, like, can I...
You're not making sense. If we prove that Venezuela demilitarizes the border as a result of their economy increasing, there's no longer an existential threat to Venezuela or to
Wait.
Colombia.
Why exactly do they demilitarize if the economy goes
The
up?
only reason they're militarizing the border right now is to proliferate the illicit drug trade. If we give them a legal means of gaining revenue, they no longer need to militarize the
I mean,
border.
the drug trade would still be good for them, though, right? Like, we would just say we solve for the economy better. It's like,
So we can agree that the economy is the eternal link into Colombia's incentive to go to conflict.
no, but we would say we just solve for it better.
Can you say something besides that? Because if you say that, it concedes what I'm saying.
I'm saying we solve for the economy better, but that's not even the reason that he's like Colombia.
You haven't
is
articulated
risky.
another reason. I'm saying that if we prove the economy gets better in Venezuela, Venezuela is no longer an existential threat to Colombia. They don't risk their own lives.
Right. We just say we disagree with that. Can I ask a question about oil?
Sure.
It's like, do oil prices, like, why are they still going up? Like, if Venezuela is exporting more, I understand they've gone up according to you, but why do they keep going up?
Venezuela's exports are higher in terms of price on the market that drives up global
So
oil
they keep
prices.
going up? Like, why does it keep going
Yes, because supply goes down, demand remains constant, price goes up.
up? Okay. We'll take some prep starting now.
Yeah, we see the oil decrease like 33% January. So. This is from January 7th, 2020.
Alright. We'll take prep starting. It literally is.
Just a headline.
Yeah, we'll keep running prep starting there. Okay, we're good. There's like 10 seconds left. How's that? You have it back. Okay.
It's on camera.
I know.
Alright, so the order is just going to be our case, And there it is. Is everyone good? On our contention, when we conceded dealings, we're not going for first contention. On our second contention, they give you two responses. The first one is that Maduro is never going to put back on price controls and currency regulations because it is benefiting Maduro. But what Pike 15 shows you is that Maduro blames the private sector for all of the for the economic collapse. If he was given the option to marginalize the private sector, he is, because he's a socialist leader. He doesn't want the private sector to exist, so he's going to marginalize it. Secondly, they talk about dollarization. We're literally not talking about dollarization. We're talking about things like removing price controls and removing currency controls. That's what leads us to our impact. But now on the link chain, what Benziquin shows you is that price controls and currency controls in the past has stifled domestic production. That's why Bias is really good. Ortega is really good. He shows you that price controls were the reason why the economic collapse happened. Fortunately, sanctions fall back, as Bias shows you that U.S. sanctions have pressured Maduro into reforming and releasing all these price controls and currency controls from the private sector. That's why Argus shows you that the private sector is projected to grow up to 25% of Venezuela's GDP. And that's why Smith shows you that inflation fell by 3 million%, and inflation is projected to fall even more until the rest of the year continues. That's really good, as that leads us to our impacts. What Alvarez 20 shows you is that market liberalization is really key because it fosters long-term economic growth, and that's why Lopez shows you that economy is projected to grow by 4% in 2020, accounting for these free market reforms. Now, on their case. A couple of problems with a couple of responses that aren't really adequately responded. First of all, our Cohen 20 card, who shows you that joint ventures are projected to rebound oil to around pre-sanction levels. They tell you that incentive to privatize still exists regardless, but we would tell you that's not the link. What we're trying to say is that oil is rebounding. At the point where they can see that oil is rebounding because of joint ventures, they have no link because their link is oil going down. But secondly, we tell you that Reuters 19 shows you is that oil exports are rising rose 20% just in December 2019. They give you two responses. First of all, they tell you even if Venezuela is producing more oil, that doesn't mean they can export more oil, but our card is specifically about oil exports. But second of all, they tell you this holistic analysis, because this holistic analysis said that oil exports dropped by 33% from January to December of 2019, but our study is just December 2019. The trend right now is we're seeing oil exports go up. Even if oil exports got destroyed in the past, sanctions are creating oil exports to rebound right now. That's why you have to keep sanctions, or that's why it doesn't matter if you keep sanctions insofar as oil exports are rebounding. But third of all, the Yates card that goes uncontested. What Yates shows you is that even if Maduro did make revenue, the $6 billion of revenue they talk about, even if Maduro did make revenue, he wouldn't funnel into helping the economy and making the economy a better place. That's why he shows you that's why Yates shows you that this economic this drop in this oil loss revenue is just a drop in the bucket, because $633 billion were lost because of economic mismanagement. At the point where Maduro is a bad leader, and that's why the economy is failing. Sanctions don't have anything to do with this. For these reasons, we engage.
Okay. We're on track.
gonna start on our second contention, and then we'll go to their case. Is everyone ready? We'll start on oil, you can group all of their responses. Even if exports are increasing, production is increasing, it does not matter if sales and profits are not increasing too. They drop the Watson-Emerson summary, do not want them responsible for the first time in final focus. The Watson-Emerson is very explicit in saying the transportation costs and the lack of refiners creating low quality oil are going to offset the potential profit gains. At that point, there's literally no way they're making a profit. That's why the Reuters evidence conceded says the prices are increasing by 2%. The status quo in the Krauss evidence, which is also dropped in summary, tells you that Venezuela's economy is supposed to shrink by 26% as a direct consequence of sanctions. This is really important because we saw through our first war, the 11th evidence indicates that Venezuela was once dependent on America because we accounted for 75% of exports, but the Krauss evidence indicates that as a direct result, we're going to shrink their economy by 26%. That's why the average evidence indicates that production has fallen by 37%, and Bloomberg finds your revenue is at its lowest point since 1989. Then they just say that Maduro would have pocketed the money anyway. No, the Bristow evidence accounts for all this and finds the economy is operating at 19% capacity. This is really important because this means even Maduro pocketed some level of the cash. Our argument is that more of it could have been allocated to people in social programs, which on that would have increased economic growth. That growth is lost as a direct result of sanctions. Then we saw through our, on the impact level, they dropped the second impact in summary. Do not them extend new defense on and final focus. The Iran's evidence indicates that once Venezuela's oil sector hits zero, which is very near because Bloomberg finds the revenue is so low, we said it's going to cause a global recession because prices will increase from $70 to $130 because no one can compensate for Venezuelan oil production. That is really important because that, according to IMF, is going to push 900 million people to poverty because the global economy is interconnected. This is always the case for a few reasons. First is on probabilities 100% conceded. The second is because it controls the internal link to things like conflict. That is conceded. Wayne coming out a second rebuttal in first summary. At that point, we say we have the strongest link into civil conflicts across the world. That also outweighs on scope because even if they win one small Colombian Venezuelan conflict, we say on net you're increasing the risk of more conflict. The second thing it outweighs is on scope because you're affecting the entire world and putting them into poverty. At that point, we say that all global economic, other countries around the world are going to probably even if they solve for just Venezuela, we say we solve for the entire world by decreasing the price of oil. Let's go to their case. On their subject about Colombia, they can see the defense here, they mishandle a turn. They can see the fact that the root cause of Venezuela militarizing on the border in the status quo is low economic growth. The reason why is because they need to get the illicit drug trade. But if you lift sanctions and you allow Maduro to go towards legal streams of revenue, which is really important because that means that he's not going to have to militarize on the border, which kills off Colombia's incentive to go towards war. We also can see the fact that insofar as Maduro is there in the status quo, the risk of conflict is actively increasing, which is important because that means you co-op their BBC impact about 220,000 people is always the case on irreversibility in any other offense they go for because no one's impacting your death besides this impact specifically. At that point, if we had a marginal link into this turn, we're going to win the round. On their second contention about the future, they mishandled the Lopez Index. Do not let them continually go in final focus and say that economic growth is increasing, but it is not. They can see the effect that Lopez is what A. One author is just randomly starting with no methodology, but B. They can see the UN evidence, which is the converse to it, which indicates that what's going to happen in 2020 is economic growth is actually going to decrease. The reason why, if you prefer our evidence here, is because it's actually a methodology done by a group of people, not just one random Venezuelan economist who wants to say that his country is doing well. At that point, we said that they have no impact off their second contention. There's no proof the economy is actually doing better. At that point, even if you want to evaluate their link, there are a couple issues here. One, we said that reforms are not needed because they say the economy is benefiting the status quo. This puts them in a double bind because either A, the economy is improving the status quo, and if that's really true, Maduro is never going to backtrack reform, or alternatively, the economy is not benefiting the status quo, and the Lopez evidence is false. At that point, there's no reason why privatization to begin into the good thing. On the ERB yesterday, they say they don't talk about dollarization. Yes, they do. Currency controls of dollarization. The ERB says when you affirm you increase dollarization by pegging the American growth revolver as unique to affirming the increase GDP by 3%, links into their case.
Alright, you guys ready for Grand Cross? Yeah. You guys have the first question whenever you're ready.
Cool. So, I'm still confused about how prices are still continuously going up.
Okay.
Like, you tell me prices rose, why do they keep rising?
Here's the issue. Venezuela cannot sell oil at the prices that it used to be able to because it loses the ability of having the low transport costs with the United States and losing access to refineries with the United States.
So it rose. Why is it still rising?
Because
like, we haven't hit the recession yet. I don't understand
So
why
what
it's still-
Martin explains is that over time, Venezuela is losing more and more revenue. As a result, they have less and less money to invest in their oil industry, which is exacerbating the problem, driving up the price in the long
Venezuela
run.
is essentially producing oil which costs money, and they're not making any money back. So they're actively indebting themselves as they produce oil with sanctions on them. Because it's almost like they're spending X amount of dollars on a barrel and making zero back because they're spending it all on transportation costs.
So then the next barrel they sell, they had tried to hike up the prices a little bit more,
Right.
as that
That's why
compounds
the
with
revenue is
millions of
actively
barrels.
increasing.
Prices go up.
Okay. Let's talk about this idea that the currency controls are not dollarization.
I mean,
Okay, yeah. So,
But, like,
so we're clear that our impact of dollarization is a straight turn on your case.
No, because we would say that sanctions are causing him to reform the entire economy. Like, it's not just dollarization that we're
So
going
it's more holistic. So let's talk about Maduro's
price controls, dollarization.
So let's talk about Maduro's incentive to reform. The evidence that you read at the bottom of your case says that the biggest benefactor of the economy doing better as a result of these reforms is the Maduro regime.
Wait.
So if Maduro is benefiting,
We don't say that.
Yeah, your author does. Your author says that the biggest benefactor of the current reforms and the current economy doing better is the Maduro regime
Are
itself.
you talking about the Corrales evidence?
Yeah.
No, the Corrales evidence says Maduro would never want to do this liberalization policies because it hurts him. But he has already done
It definitely says that the reforms are benefiting
Yeah,
him,
he
and
probably
even if
uses
Corrales
them.
doesn't say it, we've been saying it since the beginning of the round.
Yeah.
The Maduro regime benefits when the economy does better, it's able to consolidate more power and stuff like that.
No.
Why would they revert these policies?
When you refer.
Yeah, so what Pike explains is Maduro really hates the private sector. It makes sense. When you control
Right,
your
right.
entire country's economy, you get obviously more revenue, things like that. But when you free up the private sector, that like takes more money out of Maduro's hands and into the people's hands. But he doesn't want to do
But
that.
let's be clear how Maduro is privatizing. Is he just giving full-on projects to the private sector?
He's taking off price controls, things that hampered the private sector in the past.
Okay, but the way that Maduro is actually privatizing is through joint ventures, which you talk about
We said
yourself.
that's one way.
The
yes.
Venezuelan government literally has a law that says that any given project, when privatized, can only be 40% private and 60% public. So Venezuela is not losing out on control. They still have the majority controlling body
that's
in
less
every
than,
project.
That's less than 100% of the money
Yeah,
going.
but
But
it's-
we'd say there's multiple other ways they're liberalizing right now that isn't joint venture. We
And
just
our
don't-
argument is, if they benefit the economy, they benefit Maduro. He has no reason to revert.
If Maduro controls the entire country, he gets all the benefits. If he has to let the private sector grow, he doesn't, but the people do. That's why it's different. Alright, let's go. We have like 10 seconds.
Okay.
It's going to start off on our case and then go to theirs. The winner of this round is the one who better solves for economic growth. That's why their Colombia turn doesn't matter if we win our second contingent. Let's go there now. There are a couple of responses. First, he says they're never going to actually redo the reforms because they help Maduro, but it doesn't make sense. Our Pike evidence indicates Maduro always blames the private sector. If you're a socialist leader who wants to control your entire country, obviously you want all of the revenue. That's why he put price controls on in the past. He wanted everything to go to himself. But our bias part indicates because sanctions hurt specifically Maduro's imports, he had to free up the private sector. That's not good for Maduro, but that's good for the entire country. That's the only reason he's doing it right now is because of sanctions. Then they go for this dollarization turn. But we would say as part of these liberalizing reforms, dollarization is going up. It's not unique to their world, but in our world you have more things than just dollarization, like the lifting of price controls that's currently helping the Venezuelan economy. And this is really key because Ortega concludes that price controls were the root cause of the economic collapse that we would say they're trying to impact out to with all of this recession stuff. And what's really key is the Smith evidence finds that some economists estimate that hyperinflation will end by the end of the year, but even if it doesn't, inflation's already fallen by almost 3 million%. And that's really important because even if the Lopez card is correctly indicted, Alvarez tells you in the long term, liberalization is the only way to solve for the Venezuelan economy. If you affirm and let Maduro put on all of these price controls and state controls again, the economy just goes back to where it was before sanctions were on, which was in a terrible place. That's really bad for long-term stability. But Patton finds when other countries liberalize, it's really good for decreasing poverty and things like that. We know in the status quo that sanctions are pressuring him to liberalize. We don't know if affirming somehow solves this oil price spike that leads to the economic recession that they're talking about, which on their case, the Reuters and Cohen responses both indicate that even if oil production and profit and all of these things fell in 2019, the recent trend within the last couple months is it's rebounding up to almost pre-sanctions levels, and that's really important because even if they get this oil profitability thing, Yates finds Maduro's just going to pocket it anyway. They're not solving for this long-term recession. We should have already seen it happen, and oil's getting better. It's not going to happen in their world. Don't let them go for the Wang stuff.
Everyone ready? Starting on our second contingent. The round's over when they undercover our second contention. You're going to have conceded Wang here. He just says that oil production is going back up at the end of 2019. The problem is they miss the Watson frontline, which says oil production literally does not matter. We can see that oil production is going up right now, but the Watson evidence says that they have to increase the prices of this because these sanctions are driving up the prices without access to things like oil refineries in America and high transfer costs as a result of these sanctions. Insofar as that is true, you give us complete access to our global recession impact, which goes uncontested in Final Focus. Our evidence indicates that as a result of these sanctions, we are seeing oil increase globally as 2% right now, and it's
is set to continue to increase. The ardent evidence indicates that it's going to go up to $130, and our evidence indicates that once it reaches $110, that's enough to cause a global recession, thrusting 900 million people into poverty. Again, conceded weighing here. 1, you have a 100% probability goes uncontested all the way up to final focus. Then it also gives us the keenness like into conflict and stuff like that, which has irreversible impacts like death, for example. And finally, on scope, even if they solve for the Venezuelan economy, the 900 million people that are going to be thrust into poverty as a result of trying to benefit the Venezuelan people far outweighs that. But then go to their first contention. Also, they try to just like kick out of it by saying, oh, solving for growth is like a much better way. But they don't respond to the warranting. We say that right now, Maduro has to militarize the border, which has a high chance of miscalculation, which is only exponentially increasing in the status quo. By giving them a legal means of benefiting from the economy, there's literally no chance of conflict in the affirmative world, saving 220,000 people. That is conceded. There's literally no, they don't respond to the weighing, which says that it is irreversible, which outweighs poverty. So even if you, so solving for growth doesn't solve for their first contention. That's 2 very clean pieces of offense. I don't even need to touch their second contention. But group all of their offense about the reforms, it doesn't matter. Even if all of these reforms take place, it literally does not matter because they concede that the ERBS can only be implemented when you vote for the affirmative. The Associated Press says that when you vote for the affirmative, you get rid of these sanctions, and as a result, we are able to peg the bolivar to the dollar, which increases the GDP by 3%. This goes uncontested. They don't tell you any contextualization of what the growth is doing and what these reforms are doing. In fact, the United Nations says we're going to see further contraction in 2020, which means that you weigh a 3% increase in GDP as a result of the ERBS in the AF world versus the uniqueness of which is with their current reforms, which is why the United Nations finds they're currently contracting. It's pretty clear to vote.
I have a couple of cards I want to see from the app. Can I see Martano, the UN evidence, and Watson? And from the